Good morning. We have some good presentations today on contaminants of emerging concern. A couple of those presentations are going to look specifically on PFAS, and this is a topic that I know a lot of state and federal agencies are focusing a lot of energy on right now. There's just so much to learn in terms of the science behind PFAS and the prevalence and treatment of PFAS, and it's complicated just because of just the number of PFAS compounds and just the unique characteristics of each of those compounds. So I know just a couple of weeks ago, EPA announced that it intended to form a council on PFAS, and so this is one of these topics that I know we're just going to be hearing about a lot more, and we're hearing about it a lot right now, but we'll be hearing about it a lot more in the future. Before we go to the speakers, though, I just want to provide a quick update on the status of discharges from the Verso Luke paper mill. I think many of you probably know that MDE entered a consent decree with Verso Luke on March 31st. Under the terms of that consent decree, Verso Luke will be required to stop discharging pulp liquor into the Potomac River. They're also required to do investigation of sources on the site and find out what the extent of the contamination is on their site as well. Required to develop a remediation plan to address the contamination that they identify, and then implement that remediation plan in order to remediate the site. Finally, the consent decree requires that Verso Luke pay a $650,000 penalty. I don't have a lot of detail beyond that and beyond what was written in the consent decree, but if folks on this meeting want a periodic update, that's something I can do and maybe provide more information as it becomes available. With that, I think we will move along to the presentations. Our first presentation today is from Dr. Erik Rosenfeldt, process technologies, and a senior member of the firm's drinking water and applied research groups. He has over 21 years of experience in the drinking water field, engaged in research, design, and optimization efforts of conventional and advanced drinking water treatment processes for addressing emerging water quality concerns. In this capacity, he's been involved in many different water quality and treatment projects for clients throughout the Potomac River and its tributaries. He serves on the Occoquan Watershed Monitoring Subcommittee in Northern Virginia, and recently was the managing principal investigator for the DOEE and US EPA funded research program titled Co-Managing CECs and Nutrients for a Much Healthier Potomac Watershed. And that happens to be the title of his presentation today. So here's his presentation.
Okay, Erik, I'm going to give you screen sharing capability. You should see a prompt.
Perfect. I was looking for that frantically. Let's see. Which screen can you all see? That's what I'm a little worried about.
We've got the presentation up.
Oh, outstanding. All right. One last question, Christina. Can you see my cursor moving now?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah, this is great. It's going to work out. Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Christina. Thank you, everybody, for letting me come back and talk about this project again. I think you guys have been hearing about this project now for a long time. I think the first time I came in to talk about this was right at the beginning of the first of these projects, and that was back in 2014. And I kind of, this is going to be a lot of information thrown at you because I wanted to just give an overview of the whole project that we've done. Obviously, I know quite a few people on this call, and quite a few of the folks on this call actually participated in one way or another on this project. So I'd be very happy to talk to anybody at great detail about any of this. But we're not going to be here all day, so this is about maybe an inch and a half deep. overview of this entire project just because of the volume of the amount of work that was done. So I'm excited to talk about this. This is really kind of wrapping up, excuse me, where we've been over the past, 5 or 6 years. And it was a good time to do this because the latest piece of this puzzle, the EPA STAR grant, wrapped up in December of 2020, and we were able to submit at the end of last year a big report that's publicly available now. What we're going to talk about today, I mentioned it's going to be kind of an overview of the whole program. I wanted to talk about some of the unique pieces of this program. It's has been a unique and very fruitful collaboration over the years. I kind of wanted to talk through that a little bit, and then make a nod to the program drivers that initiated this study, and then quickly just map out what the approach looked like in general and how these really two pretty big projects blended together to make this pretty extensive survey of conventional and emerging contaminants in the Potomac from a couple of different looks. So, and then we'll just finish up with a little bit of a summary and some big takeaways. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that unique collaboration. This really was a fantastic regional collaboration. These are the co-PIs of the project. Of the EPA STAR project, and really the folks who have been involved all along. I do want to mention, of course, that there's many others that were involved in this work, from students, practitioners, lots of people on this phone call, analytical support staff. It really was a neat opportunity to work with a lot of really great minds in the region, and has just been way cool. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the project drivers. They go back over a decade. Some of these issues kind of came to a head with the release of some USGS research in pretty much 2010 to 2012 timeframe. I'm sure everybody remembers this. This is the big intersex fish work that got picked up, and places like the Washington Post made some pretty good headlines. But this was essentially the driver. Some of these estrogen style intersex fish responses that were observed in the Potomac, and a desire to maybe understand a little better where some of these the linked estrogenic compounds could have been coming from. So this hit the news in early 2010, and it was based on these studies, which Vicki Blazer and Luke Iwanowitz, Luke is a co-PI on this project, were involved in through USGS, through the Leetown, West Virginia facility, where they did a lot of work identifying intersex prevalence and severity of intersex fish, and then actually relating that back to land use with some very, very interesting findings. Things like wastewater treatment plant flow may have been linked to severity of intersex fish, but weren't necessarily linked to the prevalence of intersex fish, right? And just the number of wastewater treatment plants in an area didn't have any link with this presence of intersex fish. But things like agricultural land use, animal density, those had much higher correlations or with the presence of some of these intersex fish. And then we started looking at this land use a little bit and recognized that the Potomac River watershed is just an awesome test bed for looking at some of these land use correlations. As you guys know, you have this fantastic just continuum of land use from a very, very forested region up in the upper Potomac through this agricultural belt and then into the urban Metro DC area before heading down in the tidal region. This area, this land use gradient just has turned into being an opportunity to really get a good sense of how some of these pollutants correlate, or constituents might correlate to different land use. So that was those were the drivers. That was what we were looking at. That was what made this such an awesome opportunity. And here was sort of the roadmap of our approach. Basically, it came down to a focus on both point source and non-point sources. And then we took that focus and we threw all the analytical book we could come up with at it. We did everything from typical water quality constituents to some really advanced geochemical tracing and some TOC characterization. And then we also had multiple ways to quantify these contaminants of emerging concern. We did things like GCMS, MS to figure out which ones were present. We also looked at some bioassays to see how they sort of worked on the bulk. And we ground all that together to take a look at these three main objectives, which were to take a look at the fate of both nutrients and EDCs subjected to select point and non-point source nutrient control strategies. Again, this is we were really able to take a deep dive into this because of the nature of the Potomac watershed, the fact that it's that nutrients have been such a focus on this watershed given its proximity to the bay. So this was a really unique opportunity to take a look at impacts associated with those. And then we also wanted to take a look at assessing the relative contributions of nutrients and EDCs, or CECs, I should expand this, from point and non-point discharges into that rivershed. So taking a look at where some of these compounds are coming from and really how they might be effectively addressed. And so we were trying to grind all that up into developing some tools for source water management. We've got some pretty cool hotspot analysis tools, which allow us to kind of zero in on the sub-watersheds that might be, that might correlate with high presence of CECs or nutrients, not only hot spots, but also hot moments. So there's differences throughout the year, as you can imagine, particularly with things like pesticides or EDCs that are very runoff oriented. And then we kind of worked all that together at the end into a prioritization framework for potential future management of both nutrients and some of those CEC sources. So I got a little bit lengthy into that, so I'm going to have to make up my time somewhere. But this is probably where I just kind of wanted to show how long and how kind of a series of fortunate events this has been. Vicki and Luke did some of the groundbreaking work in 2010, and then Sudhir, Luke, myself, and Dr. Kaushal, Sujay Kaushal from the University of Maryland, we all met at a symposium that was put on at George Washington University. I remember the day, and we had this great discussion about potentially collaborating on some of this work. We just needed to find the funding. And so then some opportunities arose through funding, particularly associated with the Water Quality Assurance Amendment Act of 2012, which I'm sure everybody here is familiar with, and then this EPA STAR proposal. So we were able to sort of capitalize on some of that to do some nice work, really intensive field sampling in 2014 and 2015, and then again in 2017 through 2019 to get some good data to do some of this analysis. Okay, and so quickly I'm going to talk about some of these projects in specific. And again, I wish I had more time to really get into some of these because there's some really cool stuff, but I'm very happy to talk about this at great length. I guess on a as requested. But we'll start by talking about this initial study, which we defined impacting endocrine disruption on the Potomac River. So the funding mechanism was the Water Quality Assurance Amendment Act of 2012. Jessica Brandt, I don't know if you're still on the line here, but if you are, or if you are on the line, I'm sure you remember this. We had some interesting back and forth about trying to wrap this thing up specifically. This was a project or a program mandated by the Washington, D.C. Council that had wanted to take a look at presence of emerging contaminants and essentially mandated quarterly testing for unregulated contaminants in the drinking water, in the district's drinking water and wastewater effluent. What we decided to do was maybe come up with perhaps a little bit more of a relevant regulatory approach than just measuring the Blue Plains effluent for a series of emerging contaminants. We tried to broaden it a little bit to take a look at what was really maybe providing some impact on the potential drinking water source for the DC area. So we expanded, we took some liberties with this mandate, and we expanded it a little bit to develop this resulting project, where the objectives were really to evaluate the upstream and downstream impacts from nutrient control, agricultural management, stormwater management, and wastewater treatment strategies on some of these estrogenic EDC compounds. So we had, that was the first objective, and then the other one was to evaluate the impacts of the estrogenic EDCs in the receiving waters, attributed to, again, looking at this point versus non-point source control. So we have this question, sort of, what can you do with about $270,000, which was the budget? And the answer is really to get a pretty cool initial data set. You'll notice, and you'll notice this especially when we get into the EPA STAR, but we had a couple of sites in the agricultural area of the Potomac Rivershed, couple of sites in the more urban area, and they're all tied really closely together because we were trying to get basically, all things equal, what are the impacts of BMPs? So in this Ben's Run sub-watershed, we had a tributary with BMP installation focused on ag BMPs and without, and they're so close that basically everything else was considered equal. Rain, the land use, all that. Same thing with the urban sites that we looked at, and then we really did a deep dive into Blue Plains with some testing throughout the facility, and we had another CSO in the area that we identified, which was another interesting point to study. As I mentioned, we took a look at a lot of analytical techniques. We had GCMS or LCMS methods to look at the hormones that we were looking for and their metabolites. We had some biological activity assays that Luke contributed. I should say that the analytical was performed by Diana Aga up at the University of Buffalo, who's the leading CEC detection experts in the country. And then we did some advanced geochemistry study looking at NOM characterization, the natural organic matter, as well as some of the nutrient isotopes, which was really cool. At University of Maryland, they found ways to link the presence of heavy oxygen and heavy nitrogen to the sources of where some of these nutrients have come from. So we took a look at doing some of that. On the analytical side, we really couldn't do that broad of a CEC scan, so we really looked at focusing on estrogen-based endocrine disrupting chemicals, again, focusing out of on some of the potential impacts associated with those early fish studies. As I mentioned, the sampling locations were paired watersheds with and without BMPs. We looked at an agricultural site, an urban site, and then a wastewater treatment plant. We went out and we sampled every other month for a year. I think we ended up with 7 or 8 data sets because we took a look at a rain event and then a nearly drought event, so really low flow as well. And then we also, so the objectives were to assess the performance of BMPs. We looked at ag BMPs, urban stormwater BMPs, and those were basically nutrient control strategies, and we were trying to see how well they co-managed some of these EDCs. And then we also took a look at Blue Plains, and as I mentioned, we did some sampling throughout the facility to kind of get a sense of the what ifs, right? So everybody in pretty much everybody in the Potomac Aquifer that discharges wastewater has advanced nutrient control in their treatment scheme, but we wanted to take a step back and say, what if we were any other of the 90% of American watersheds that don't require this extensive nutrient control? What's the impact, the potential impact from that in terms of sources of these contaminants to their prospective watersheds? So we got a lot of graphs that look like this. I don't expect anybody to have this memorized. There's a couple of take-homes. First of all, if you focus on the blue bars down the lines for both ag and urban, you'll see the the concentrations, I should say. This is a concentration graph of the water coming from these sub-watersheds that don't have BMPs installed. And then if you take a look at the red, you see the impact of BMPs, and these are these paired watersheds. And so, all else equal, it appears that the concentrations coming out of these nutrient-controlled BMP streams are great, are much lower compared to the concentrations in those streams without implementation of BMP. And then over here, take a look at the blue, which is post-secondary. This is a facility that does not have enhanced nutrient control versus the final effluent of Blue Plains. And you can see, particularly for the estrogens and the nitrogen, it is just night and day between what's coming out of that facility on the out of the actual facility versus what's coming out of this. So the second objective quickly was to try to assess the relative contribution of EDCs from wastewater treatment plants performing biological nutrient removal compared to other sources. And we saw this, and we continued to see this in the subsequent studies, that the blue piece of the pie here, which is agricultural non-point inputs, and the orange piece of the pie, which is urban non-point inputs, are significantly larger than our point sources at this point. And this goes through both conventional contaminants like nitrogen, phosphorus, DOC, and then a lot of these EDCs as well, both from a bulk estrogenic activity and from an individual compound perspective. We did this table, which I'm not going to, again, another complicated table, but it's useful to look at it. And if you just want to focus on a case study, what this shows is the highlighted boxes are statistically, the concentrations of those boxes are statistically significantly different when it's, this source, the CSO, as opposed to this source, the background Potomac. So what this says is that things like CSO, agricultural inputs without BMPs, urban inputs without BMPs are statistically different, and in this case, larger concentrations than what's observed in the background Potomac. But when you look at Blue Plains effluent or another wastewater treatment plant effluent or the implementation of BMPs, then you lose that statistically significant difference between what's in the background Potomac, which means that these sources are not contributing greatly to the concentration gradient seen in the Potomac, whereas these other sources potentially have much greater impact to the levels in the Potomac. So sort of wrapping up that project one, I know I'm trying to get through pretty quick, but we found that an annual load analysis, so we extended that concentration analysis to a load analysis, indicated that non-point sources accounted for over 80% of the EDC load of the Potomac. Blue Plains itself contributed less than 3% of the load for EDCs. And then BMPs showed significant reductions in estrogenic EDC inputs to the aquifer. Sorry, I've been involved in SWIFT a little too long. To the Potomac watershed from agriculture and urban runoff. And these were things like restricting livestock access to streams, planting grasses for stream shading and improving stream bank stability for the agricultural side. Things like maintaining shaded habitat, reducing impervious area, restoring stream habitat on the urban side. And then finally, Blue Plains, that profile sampling revealed large reductions between secondary and advanced nitrogen control for the emerging contaminants. So the second project, where we really actually relied a lot on the same approach to secure the funding here, was this EPA STAR funded project called Improving Reuse for a Healthier Potomac. We submitted that proposal in 2014. It was a really interesting week. I know it was 2014 because we submitted it the week before I had we had our last child. So I was sort of scrambling to get that done. We also had Dr. Grizzard was involved in this, and he had just had knee surgery, and Sujay, Dr. Kaushal, ended up with pneumonia this final week. I mean, it was a pretty intense week, but we got it submitted, and we waited for about 3 years, 2 years before we found out it was funded. And then we were finally able to do the work between 2016 and really 2016 and 2019. 2020 ended up, well, as it was for everybody, kind of a disaster, and it just took a long time to wrap everything up. But we finished writing in that last year. So we had the same approach, except for we had this idea to sort of make it relevant to that EPA call to look at whether reuse fit in. And this was planned, you know, there's a lot of instances of planned indirect potable reuse in the Potomac watershed. So we wanted to look at whether this fit in any way to this cycle, and if so, where and how does it fit in, and what are the impacts? So the objectives for this study were to use multiple analytical, biological activity, isotopic, and fluorescent tracers. You've seen all those. They should be very familiar by this point. To identify and track spatial and temporal variability in hotspots of EDCs and nutrient sources. So as I mentioned, we're not just looking at the, you know, where these contaminants might be coming from, but also potentially when throughout the year. And then we took that first data set, and we found some more relevant paired watersheds, and we could really dig into more and different BMPs, and we could look at the impacts of these BMPs on source controls of both nutrients and really CECs. We expanded our analytical list as well to involve to look at more than just some of the estrogenic endocrine disruptors. And then finally, we brought this together, and this is where a lot of folks on this call participated, to take a look at building a framework for a sustainable future co-management approach, and taking a look at benefits of the reuse and management strategies within that new framework. So this is the Potomac watershed again. Here's our sample list for this first year, and the first thing you should notice is that there's a lot of sites on here. We sampled every major tributary and main stem at those tributary locations to really get a comprehensive look at the presence of nutrients and CECs throughout the watershed. USGS was extremely helpful in facilitating this sample collection, but those guys over at the University of Maryland were super busy for a year in running all of these analyses. And again, you know, we got this whole big swath of sites with different land uses, and it just allowed us some really cool opportunities for analysis. One of the analyses we did was this hotspot and hot moment analysis, and this is for total dissolved nitrogen, but you can really see based on the darker blue, the hotter the spot. You can not only see that for just geographically, but also for each of these quarterly sampling events, you could see how a particular sub-watershed changed in its impact throughout the year. So we did that for nutrients, and we could also, again, overlay that with the land use maps. And we also did it for some of the estrogens. So this was some pretty cool analysis, and we could see that you know, the nitrogen low hotspots and the estrogen hotspots weren't necessarily the same hotspots. Kind of a neat study. Again, we took a look at correlating some of those hotspots with land use patterns in those sub-watersheds, and we were able to come up with some idea of where the impacts were coming from. So this is actually the sort of the major findings from year one, were a lot of these pie charts, which showed for conventional pollutants the contribution of the different land uses. Again, well, we looked at, you know, since such a large portion of the upper Potomac is forested, we actually included that. And you can see that the majority of the water actually comes from the forested portion of the watershed. But then a majority of the pollutants were coming from the agricultural inputs, the urban inputs, with point source having a relatively small contribution to the loads of these conventional pollutants within the watershed. Nothing really surprising here, considering how much investment has gone on to reduce the loads of these conventional nutrients to the watershed from those point sources. Interestingly, we found that approach of managing those point sources has also been very effective in terms of managing CECs. And then again, where those investments have not been made, particularly on agricultural non-point and urban non-point, you see large contributions of these estrogens and also of herbicides and insecticides. So again, year two, we got all that information. Excuse me. We knew where these inputs were coming from, and we decided this is sort of focused on, well, what can we do about it? What might be effective management strategies for some of these emerging contaminants in those non-point source areas? So really, this should be a much sort of more comprehensive map. We found more sites in Maryland and DC to take a look at, but we also extended it to sites in Virginia to look at some of these paired watersheds again and really dig down to what was working and what was not working with some of these BMP approaches. And what we found generally were implementation of BMPs tended to help, particularly on the emerging contaminant front. You know, the ag BMPs had some reasonably large, had some impact on dissolved nitrogen, SRP, DOC, not huge impacts, but it had very large impacts on reductions of some of these contaminants, particularly the estrogens, perhaps less so on some of the herbicides and pesticides that were used. We didn't see quite the impact that we saw with those estrogen load reductions. And this sort of relates, I think, to the nature of some of the BMPs, which were really focused on, at least the ones we looked at, which were really focused on things like keeping livestock out of streams and getting those stream beds in good shape, which, you know, for the estrogens, which, you know, a major source of those are those livestock operations, it should have a big impact, and some of those you know, herbicide applications maybe less so of an impact. Urban stormwater BMPs, we saw a similar, we saw a little bit of a different conventional impact where we didn't have much reduction in dissolved nitrogen, lots of reduction in soluble phosphorus, and significant reduction in DOC between the BMP and no BMP implemented watersheds. We didn't see as much of a reduction in some of the estrogens, and we saw more of a reduction in some of the herbicides and pesticides. So this was an interesting finding, the difference in management capabilities of the urban versus the agricultural BMPs. The impact, again, we saw these plots compare the loads from the concentrations in the effluent of these point sources with the concentrations in the river at those points. So you can see that for most of these emerging contaminants, there's not a whole lot coming from the wastewater plants, with the exception of some of these insecticides. This was actually an interesting finding that we need to do a little bit more digging in to figure out why. You know, for example, fipronil is a pesticide targeting ticks and you know, other nuisance type organisms, and it'd be interesting to see why so much of that is coming from our point source wastewater effluent facilities. You know, hopefully it's not coming through people, but maybe it is. And then we took a look at we have these great opportunities to take a look at advanced wastewater treatment and reduction of CECs using some of these advanced wastewater treatment strategies. And generally we saw reductions, additional reductions, and most of the time they were very high reductions. And this is associated with sort of beyond the nutrient reduction strategies. These are these planned potable reuse situations that are present in the Potomac watershed. We took a look at some of the impacts of the planned versus unplanned IPR with some paired watersheds. On the Potomac, there's these highly controlled, these streams with highly controlled inputs from wastewater treatment plants, and on the Maryland side, there's streams of similar size with some less advanced treatment on there. And we were taking a look at comparing the inputs of the planned and unplanned IPR situations, and you can see generally the planned had a little bit lower levels of nutrients. DOC was an exception. They were similar or even higher on the planned side. And then sort of a mixed bag on some of the estrogens. It was an interesting experiment with some of this. But there's more details, and I just don't really get into all of it at this point. So we also took a look at 2 intakes from water plants, one being in a planned IPR situation and an unplanned IPR situation. And really what we saw here was very limited difference, with the exception perhaps of atrazine, on levels of intake, of levels at the intakes between the planned IPR site and the unplanned IPR site. A conclusion that can speak to really the management of some of, or the effectiveness of those management strategies in the planned IPR case. Just recognizing that it's doing an effective job at managing the inputs or the ultimate uptake of some of these contaminants to the wastewater plant or to the drinking water plants. One more thing I just wanted to state on that was all of the compounds that we looked at, any levels that were detected throughout the system were well below ecological or human health levels of concern throughout the study. So that's a good takeaway just to share with the whole. And then finally, we took all that data and we analyzed it, and we tried to cram it into really a cost-benefit analysis for assessing the impact of different co-management strategies on EDCs and nutrients. We decided to use a multi-criteria decision analysis framework. It was based on a triple bottom line analysis, and it leveraged some work that had already been done by Hazen, actually, for the Water Research Foundation in a previous project. What this really boils down to is, how do you compare these different alternatives using the right criteria? And I put the right criteria in quotes because a lot of these are non-cost based criteria, and a lot of them have to be weighted in a way. And so the way we came up with weighting these criteria were to hold a workshop with some of the stakeholders from the region to get us consensus on the appropriate criteria and the appropriate weighting of these criteria to do the analysis. So this is where many, many people that are on the call today participated. I wanted to, again, publicly thank you all for helping out with this. It was a success beyond our wildest dreams on this project. And it was just a really neat workshop and a really neat day. I think everyone who participated will agree with that. We used this spreadsheet-based tool that Hazen had developed called Hazen Converge. It's just an MCDA tool. It's really just a spreadsheet to facilitate this analysis. But what we did was we had this workshop and we came up with a series of criteria, and then we developed us into, then we split the workshop into 3 groups. And we did it twice. We had a biased representation where you were sort of put together with your friends from your, really from, we divided it amongst, where you worked, and we got a sense of what criteria and weighting would come out of this exercise when kind of everybody in each group was basically similar in their duties, and then we kind of mixed it up a little bit, and we wanted to see the differences between these between the consensus that came out of these groups. So we looked through all the different criteria and developed these weightings based upon those groups, and then we went through using a pairwise analysis where we directly compared two criteria with each other to sort of determine, to rank those criteria and determine the weighting factors. So this was the results of that pairwise analysis. And this ended up being our final 10 evaluation criteria that went into the analysis. And they accounted for 75% of the total weighting. So they really, we think, took the stakeholders' concerns into account, and we weighted them appropriately according to these pairwise analyses. So when we put that all through the Hazen converged meat grinder, we ended up with these weighted scores, and they're weighting the stakeholders' consensus rankings of these different management approaches for, again, remember, we're co-managing nutrients and EDCs according to all of these criteria, things like cost per reduction of nutrients, capital cost of the projects that would be required, complexity of implementing policy and regulation to sort of force the issue. And you can see that the scores ended up heavily favoring favoring implementation of BMPs in the agricultural sector to try to reduce future loads of future load of nutrients and CECs to the watershed. So finally, to wrap it up, I know I've gone long and I apologize, but I'm sorry. Just to wrap the summary, which really we felt was a really comprehensive evaluation of sources and co-management opportunities for nutrients and CECs in the watershed, we found that ag inputs of nutrients and CECs really dominated the watershed inputs at this point. We saw that there was some potential impact of BMPs, although it was not as clear as that original study. The reductions in things like some of the pesticides was not as high as we perhaps anticipated out of that initial study. The urban BMPs were a little less effective for nutrient control, and they were moderately effective for the EDCs, a little more so for some of the pesticides. And then the point sources are both very effective for nutrient control and CEC control, but they're also quite expensive approaches with really minimal load impacts to the system. So our multi-criteria decision analysis indicated that implementing ag BMPs was the preferred option considering cost effectiveness, equitable impact, high performance of co-management strategies for nutrients and EDCs in the Potomac. Finally, we also had an opportunity to take some innovative approaches. I know there's going to be a lot of talk about PFAS, but I just wanted to highlight that this was a non-targeted analysis approach that Diana Aga took to just taking a look at quantifying what contaminants in these classes might be out there in the Potomac. And it was really interesting, essentially the very low levels of PFAS that they detected. And these are not the 29 PFAS that are being looked at through EPA methods. These are a suite of hundreds of potential PFAS compounds. And there were very, very low levels of PFAS found in that Potomac and in samples taken throughout the range of the Potomac. Anyway, that's just another interesting study that came out of this. And with that, again, I think I probably went over, but I do want to provide an opportunity for questions. I also provided a link here for the report. It is limited to Water Research Foundation subscribers, but if anybody wants to read it and isn't a subscriber, I do have access as an author. I can probably share that document as needed. So with that, I guess I hope I might have time for a question or two, but I'm certainly available to follow up at anybody's convenience.
We can have a few minutes for questions if anyone has one. Feel free to unmute yourself, or you can send it in a chat.
I have a comment, Erik. Christy, this is Pam Kennel, Loud and Water. I find the last thing that you shared with us incredibly important, considering the environmental working group, right? And the report that they put out, and I would say kind of scared, it's just kind of a scary thing. And I think that, you know, we need to look at this a little analytically, and what you're showing us here is something that Loud and Water has found ourselves. We've done our own, you know, we need to do a little bit of investigation, we feel, as our due diligence. And we've found that the Potomac River is really, really high quality. We're not finding PFAS. So I don't know, just give us some perspective on this a little bit from what you think and what you're seeing in the industry.
So on the PFAS issue in particular?
Yeah, on the PFAS in particular, and how, you know, is it a drinking water issue? You know, we're getting all worked up on drinking water, so it's bigger than that, isn't it?
It is. I mean, it's an issue. Again, you need to, as we've all talked about and heard about extensively, the potential exposure to some of these chemicals from drinking water sources really needs to be weighed with all the other exposures, right? The reason these chemicals are present in the environment is that they're so useful in industry and in consumer products. And, you know, that risk cup needs to be developed. And I think when it gets developed, it'll show that the drinking water exposure is, you know, not warranting the outcry perhaps that we're seeing publicly. I wanted to second your comment on the Potomac. I've seen several data sets now from the Potomac, and I am amazed at how low not only the levels being detected in the Potomac of PFAS, but also the breadth of PFAS being detected in there. It's amazing how you just don't see them, especially considering, you know, they find levels in polar bears, you know. So I've been shocked at how little PFAS there is in the Potomac. I think that's a good story, you know, to tell. You know, Pam, I hope I answered your question a little bit.
You did exactly what I was looking for, because I think it's a great story, frankly, and I think that this is the right group to help carry the story, right?
Yeah, Pam.
Thanks.
You know, I have one last comment. I hope too that one of the hopes I had of with sharing this study beyond the PFAS issue, well beyond that, was that if it sparked interest amongst this group, I'd be very happy to talk to anybody who was interested in carrying the mantle, so to speak. We have found some really interesting results. One that if I was still a professor, I think I would be able to find this and almost feel like I could make a career out of this. Unfortunately, I'm a consultant, so I don't have time to do that. So if there's anyone on this call who's interested in maybe taking the next step with this work and speaking, you know, broader on the policy perspective and things like that, I'd be super excited to talk further. I'm done on my soapbox. Any other questions?
I have a question, Erik. In terms of the effectiveness of the agricultural BMPs, did the project team consider ways to, you know, outreach and get the word out in terms of how much this will benefit our watershed and the water that, you know, all of the ag producers in our region drink?
You know, the short answer is we did not explicitly consider getting word out. We really want to figure out a way to do that, though. That's kind of the mantle I was speaking of. I would, you know, there was such an outsized impact in terms of load, and there is I think, potential opportunities with implementation of BMPs. But you're right, the hurdles towards actually getting those in the ground are big and definitely need public support, or I guess, farmer support. So that communication piece has not been explored yet, but really, really needs to be.
So Erik, this is Pam again. I don't mean to dominate the conversation, but what you've talked about here really tees up nicely with the agricultural work group report that we're going to make, where we are getting some really good traction with, federal agencies. And I think it's helping us figure out where we, as a lot of us are drinking water providers, where we can play a role, how we can help facilitate this, the agricultural BMPs. So let's talk about it again when the ag work group updates presented. I think there's potential though.
Excellent, thank you.
Well, thank you again, Erik, for being with us. Greg, would you like to introduce our next speaker?
Certainly. So our second speaker today is Rebecca Warrens. Ms. Warrens is the Natural Resource Planner from the Maryland Department of the Environment's Water Supply Program. Since joining MDE in 2019, she's been involved with a variety of program initiatives, including identifying priority source protection areas under the 2019 Farm Bill, participating in MDE's Water and Science Administration's Climate Change Work Group, and most recently, organizing and implementing the statewide public water system study for PFAS in state drinking water sources. She didn't put this on her bio, but I'm going to also note that she received MDE's Employee of the Year award on Monday, due in part to the great work that you'll see today. So with that, we'll hear Ms. Warrens' presentation, Understanding and Managing Per and Polyfluoroalkyl Substances.
Thanks, Greg, for the introduction and also the invitation to speak today on one of the many PFAS initiatives the department has taken on in the past couple of years. Sorry. I just wanted to double check that everyone can see my screen okay and that I'm coming through clearly.
Yes, Rebecca, everything looks good.
Awesome, thank you so much. So I'm sure many people in this meeting know what PFAS are, but before I get into the work that MDE has been doing, I am going to give a very brief overview about these groups of compounds. So PFAS, as many of you know, stand for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. They're a group of more than 4,000 human-made compounds and have also been detected in groundwater, surface water, soils, and other environmental media throughout the country. PFAS have been used in a variety of commercial and industrial applications and have the ability to accumulate across trophic levels and the human body. These compounds typically differ based on their carbon chain lengths, extent of their fluorination, and also their functional groups. We can be exposed to PFAS through a variety of pathways, including but not limited to drinking water, food consumption, workplace exposure, and more. And this chronic exposure of PFAS has often been linked to adverse human health effects. And with this slide, I just wanted to show how diverse the PFAS family is. So on the right-hand side of this tree with the polymer and polyfluoroalkyl substances, these two groups typically are the ones that can break down in the environment to the more terminal degradation products of the perfluoroalkyl substances. And this left-hand side of the tree is where a lot of our regulatory focus remains, just because these compounds on the left that fall under these categories are the ones that can accumulate in the environment and the body and don't typically break down. Another topic of interest I think would benefit some members on this call is this concept of PFAS treatment. PFAS treatment techniques typically divide in one of three broad categories. The first is phase transfer, or using technologies such as granular activated carbon or ion exchange. These two technologies have been proven to be efficient in both the removal of PFAS, but they also have been proven to be expensive in their maintenance. And also they pose the question of what do we do with the disposal of spent filters? The latter two treatment categories, chemical transformation and biodegradation, still have a lot of studies to go through, and they're not implemented as frequently as phase transfer, but preliminary studies have suggested that they are viable options, but the main concern here are revolving around the byproducts from these two treatment techniques. I also wanted to point out two little notes at the bottom of the screen here that the EPA does update a treatability database periodically for the public to view. And also, if you ever are posed with treating or removing PFAS from some sort of media, it's extremely important to understand the speciation of the PFAS that is present for the most optimal treatment or removal. So now I'm going to get into a little bit about how Maryland has been addressing PFAS in drinking water, and later in the presentation, some other initiatives we have underway. So a lot of our early PFAS initiatives in Maryland were primarily federally fueled. This can be seen through our first efforts under UCMR3 to monitor the 6 PFAS compounds that were listed on the screen. During this study, only one sample throughout the years of 2012 to 2015 had measurable levels of PFOA, but this was at a level well below the EPA's health advisory level for PFOA and PFAS. And since late 2019, the department has taken major strides to assessing and addressing the presence of PFAS in the state's drinking water sources. This includes the implementations of MDE's multi-phased public water system study to assess PFAS in drinking water. So from late 2019 to just recently in February 2021, we have been planning and have implemented our multi-phased approach to assessing PFAS in drinking water. The planning phases of this approach focus mainly on data collection and analysis to identify source waters potentially at risk for PFAS exposure. During this time, the department collected geospatial information for over 2,000 potential sources of PFAS throughout the state. This includes fire training areas, fire stations, military installations, EPA brownfields, and more. From here, we then turn to GIS to help us approximate nearby drinking water sources that could be impacted by these potential sources of PFAS. To do this, we drew a 1,000-foot buffer around each potential source of PFAS. Then we found and recorded the intersection of these PFAS buffers with Maryland's drinking source water protection areas. During this process, we kept record of the type and number of potential sources of PFAS that intersected with our source protection areas. And we also developed a relative risk ranking system, which assumed that some potential sources of PFAS were more likely to release PFAS than others. So for example, fire training facilities and military installations ranked higher than, let's say, an EPA brownfield, where it's unknown if PFAS was ever used or present at that facility. And I did want to point out that the database we have for the potential sources of PFAS, it's not complete, nor have we been able to confirm the use of PFAS at these sites. But once we've ranked everything, we then used information like source water type and system type to further define relative risk and prioritize our first round of sampling. So under phase 1, we considered drinking water withdrawing from groundwater, from unconfined and semi-confined aquifers, or surface water sources as higher risk than other drinking water sources, such as those from confined aquifers. This is because of the natural protection that confined aquifers have for their water. And then in addition to looking at the type of drinking water source, we also prioritize community water systems because of the relation between human health effects and chronic PFAS exposure. And then once we identified potentially at-risk source waters, we then consolidated the sampling schedule based on their respective water treatment plants. This gave us around 133 community water system water treatment plants to sample. And then in addition to that, we identified 11 reference community water system water treatment plants. These reference sites were located in HUT 12 watersheds with a 75% or more forested cover. And there were also no potential PFAS sources located in their source water protection areas. And so because of our focus on community water systems withdrawing and treating waters from surface and unconfined or semi-confined aquifers, this naturally led us to collect our samples from west of the fall line. So on the map here, the red dots represent either these potentially at-risk community water system surface water or groundwater sources, and the blue dots represent our baseline or what we perceived as our reference sources. And then some other planning efforts that went into the first phase was that we focused on collecting finished water samples first. And we also worked with the Maryland Department of Health Laboratories Administration for analysis, consulting for our sample scheduling, and also developing our sampling protocol. And under this first phase, we analyzed the finished water samples for EPA method 537.1. And then we also established project-specific action levels dependent upon the total concentrations of PFOA and PFAS. And then dependent upon these initial finished water results, these action levels kind of determined if we needed to do additional sampling, analysis, or any remedial work. And then our first phase of the study was actually completed back in February 2021. We are working on a report that I thought would be, ready to talk about today, but I think the new target date is to release it in June 2021. Just some overview highlights from the study. So PFAS weren't detected at any of the 11 reference community water system water treatment plants, but they were detected intermittently throughout the investigative sites. About 90% of the water treatment plants that we sampled from had some sort of level of detection. And only 2 of our community water system treatment plants had levels exceeding the EPA's health advisory level. Those are at Westminster and Hampstead. In both of these cases, we worked with the systems to immediately turn off the impacted treatment plants, publish a Tier 2 public notification directly to the impacted drinking water customers and then the entire system's consumers. And then we also scheduled follow-up samples from both their finished and raw water sources. And currently both treatment plants remain offline, and they're working with engineering firms to get the proper treatment in place, just because there's a great demand for drinking water in Carroll County. And we did sample the 7 water treatment plants that are treating water from the main stem of the Potomac, and we did also sample all surface water sources in the state. And there were some PFAS detected in the surface water, in the finished water from these surface water sources, but those typically remain below 10 parts per trillion. And then seemingly this is mainly a groundwater and legacy contaminant concern. At least that's what this first round of results is hinting at, but of course we need more investigation to confirm that. Currently we're in phase 2, where we used pretty much the same methodology as phase 1, but this time we expanded the PFAS search radius from 1,000 feet to 1 mile. And instead of looking at finished water, we are gathering data on raw water sources. And we're maintaining the focus on groundwater from unconfined and semi-confined aquifers, but we did sample a select few confined sources as well. So under phase 2, we're hoping that our sampling and analysis should be completed later this month, and then hopefully have some sort of summary report later in the summer. But we have about 188 sources lined up to be sampled, and these serve approximately 65 systems. And some other PFAS commitments that we've completed since 2020. We've piloted a study in the St. Mary's River to test PFAS in both surface water and oyster tissues. Here, PFAS were found intermittently throughout surface water sites and in only one oyster tissue sample. And there is a report available online for the St. Mary's pilot study. And I can link it in the chat after this. And then we also started to integrate PFAS analysis into our fish tissue monitoring framework. This framework basically allows MTE to sample fish populations across the state within a 5-year time frame. So the state is broken up into, I believe, 5 regions, and there's 15 stations per region. And the first region focused on the eastern shore, as well as we sampled around Piscataway Creek. And we're actually going back to Piscataway Creek to do a more in-depth study later this spring. Back in October 2020, we actually held a PFAS roundtable discussion with the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, where we invited PFAS experts to bring MDE staff, and I believe we had representatives from Delaware and Pennsylvania, just up to date on the state of PFAS science, as well as discuss any important data gaps, and to also solicit recommendations for the department's future PFAS work. This report is also publicly available. We have also finalized our PFAS spill response protocol for responding accidental or intentional spills for PFAS throughout the state. In addition, we've increased our web presence through the publication of many of our reports that I've discussed previously. So the water supply program, we have our own PFAS webpage. On this webpage, we have our fact sheet for our phase 1 study. The report for phase 1 will be publicly available there within the coming weeks. And the department also has a larger landing page for all the different PFAS initiatives that we have going on currently. And then one other thing that was previously completed was the state legislation that bans the use of PFAS containing foams for training or testing purposes this October, so later this year. So some other PFAS work we have underway or we're planning for the future is our continued sampling of drinking water sources. So like I said, phase 2 should wrap up later this month, and then phase 3 should start later in the summer. We are also considering adjusting our fish tissue sampling stations to be more representative of the potential sources of PFAS throughout the state. This is expected to happen in our next round of PFAS sampling, which should happen in the fall. And then, like I mentioned earlier, we're actually looking at monitoring more in depth around Piscataway Creek. We've also initiated a multi-phase wastewater treatment plant study of both effluent and biosolids. The first phase of this effort should start within the coming weeks at one particular wastewater treatment plant to get some baseline information, and then hopefully the study will expand to 15 additional treatment plants. We are also working on developing water quality criteria for PFOA and PFAS. This is in the very beginning stages, so more to come on that. And then relating back to the legislative efforts of the PFAS containing foams. We are developing outreach documents for firefighters and different firefighting associations, just reminding them of the ban, but also providing them more information about PFAS, how they're used, and any potential health risks. And then another very new initiative was our formation of the Chesapeake Bay State's PFAS work group. So far, we've only had one meeting, but basically we're meeting with different PFAS leaders in Pennsylvania, Delaware, DC, West Virginia, and Virginia to talk about contemporary PFAS issues and how we are addressing them. And then some other PFAS priorities that were identified in both the PFAS roundtable discussion and also internal discussions are listed here. So in my opinion, the most pressing issue right now is constructing and implementing a plan to monitor private wells. Also, we need to better our efforts to work with military installations as related to PFAS and shallow aquifers and their releases from the installations. Also, hopefully through the wastewater treatment plant study, we'll get a better understanding of how PFAS will have implications on our future water reuse efforts. We're also considering developing the Maryland PFAS footprint, which basically assesses, the major contributors of PFAS to the state's natural resources. And that would involve confirming that list of 2,000 plus potential PFAS sources, looking for new ones, and then working on identifying whether PFAS was used there or not. We also are considering assessing the impact of the gradient in Maryland from freshwater to estuarine to saltwater on PFAS freight and transport both in fish and then just in general transformations. Also, we're considering researching how PFAS can accumulate in shellfish, specifically in blue crabs. And then we're also considering incorporating PFAS forensics work into our future initiatives. And with that, I don't have anything else, so I can accept any questions.
Rebecca, I do have a question. This is Pam Kennel with Loud and Water. You did a really nice job. Thank you very much for a very informative presentation. And you highlighted some concerns that I think that some of us who have community groundwater systems may have concerns. I'm concerned about septic systems. And if we've got these wells in hard rock geology, for instance, the migration of, septic field effluent, we'll call it, into our groundwater seems highly likely. And so you mentioned one of your top priorities is constructing a plan to monitor private wells. And that's sort of the same thing that I'm talking about, but I'm wondering if you have anything. So you talked about wastewater treatment plants, but I'm also interested in septic systems because I think Maryland's very similar in that there are a lot of septic systems out there in the countryside, we'll say, where the private wells are located. Have you given much thought to how to kind of tackle that problem or see if it is a problem actually?
It's definitely something we are considering. Both, I would imagine the private well study would somehow link in the septic systems. The main issue we are running into right now is trying to find funding for those studies. I don't think water supply has any funds that they can appropriate to specific private well septic sampling, but that is something that I brought up with some of MDA's upper management.
But are you able to do it on community water systems that are using groundwater wells?
We may be able to. That's something that I would have to discuss further with Saeed.
Yeah, I'd be very interested going forward in what you guys are thinking on that. Thanks.
there any other questions for Rebecca?
Rebecca, this is Jin, WSSC Water. Well, first of all, thanks for the presentation and thanks for MDE doing this great work. This is a really well structured and risk-based study. I think the outcome of this study is going to be very helpful. I do have a couple of questions. Earlier in your presentation, you mentioned that under phase 1, you collected about 2,000 potential sources of PFAS, and I'm wondering if MD is open to share that information, and if you could just share a little bit more details about what kind of information you collected. Is that just the geographic information, or did you actually go into tier 2 level data? And again, if MDE is willing to share some of that with the regional utilities here. My second question is, my understanding is that you use in terms of the analytical method, you use the method 537.1 for 18 compounds. I was curious how between that method and method 533, which was also available at the time of your study, how you decided ended up choosing that method, and what's your perspective, and if you have any guidance or recommendations to share with the utilities when we either switch to new method or trying to explore new method. What is the level of proficiency that we should expect from the labs, and the confidence level that we should gauge when we explore the new methods? So if you could share some of the technical information, that would be appreciated.
Sure thing. So for your first question about the GIS database of potential sources of PFAS, I believe we are able to share that. I would have to confirm, but basically we use both state and federal level data to curate these different GIS layers. So we looked at, Maryland's GIS clearinghouse for things like fire stations, training areas, airports, runways. And then we also looked specifically at the EPA SIC codes that correspond with PFAS manufacturing practices. So we have locational data on electroplating facilities, oil refineries, also pharmaceutical plants and different manufacturing facilities. That can be shared. I'm not sure if we've been sharing it through our PIA request system, so I would assume that utilities would have to go through that process as well to get that data. In terms of analytical methods, our decision for 537.1 was completely dependent upon MDH's ability to get their lab up and running and take on this project. Our initial conversations with MDH, we're focusing on just the 6 PFAS compounds under UCMR 3. Which was a guarantee for MDH, but they were able to expand to the full suite of 18 PFAS by the time this project started. In terms of picking between 537.1 and 533, I think if you use maybe one round for both to just kind of get a baseline understanding of what is in your water, then you could probably make a more informed decision on which method to pursue in the future. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much.
Rebecca, we have one more question from Michael Nardalili.
Okay.
Michael is asking, the Virginia's ban on PFAS foam for testing or training becomes effective on July 1 of this year. How does the Maryland legislation differ, if at all, from the Virginia legislation?
I think the main differences between our two legislations are the date that the ban goes into effect. I also know that there is a fine of, I want to say, $500 for first-time offenders post the October 2021 date. Outside of that, I'm not entirely sure of the differences between the two legislations. I know in Maryland, we're working to create these outreach documents that are written in a way where people who are holding these PFAS containing foams don't get the letter and then they just dump all of their PFAS in a nearby stream or dispose of it irresponsibly and then just take the one-time fine. So that's one of the challenges that we're running into as we develop these outreach communications.
Okay, are there any other questions for Rebecca? Okay, thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Great. So with that, we'll go to our third speaker today. Our third speaker is Dr. Tony S. Singh. Dr. Singh is an environmental engineer and public health professional with a background in conventional and emerging environmental contaminants, both in terms of treatment technology development and impacts on human health. Dr. Singh has been the Deputy Office Director for the VDH Office of Drinking Water since May 2019. He has over 18 years of work experience in the environmental engineering field. He is responsible for field operations, the Division of Technical Services, and the Commonwealth's efforts on new regulatory actions, such as for recent legislation on drinking water at schools and childcare centers. He is a licensed professional engineer, a board-certified environmental engineer, and a certified safety professional. He holds a PhD in chemical and environmental engineering with a master's in environmental science and engineering, as well as a master's in public health from University of Virginia. His current and past research interests focused on water and health, especially to characterize the interrelationship between water and health that would facilitate risk assessment, prevention, or treatment of chemicals. Dr. Singh will discuss the regulatory status of per and polyfluoroalkyl substances in Virginia drinking water. So thank you.
Thank you so much for this nice and long introduction. I appreciate it. Can you hear me?
Yes, Tony, your slides and your audio is coming in clear.
Awesome, thank you. And good morning, everyone. And thank you so much, ICPRB, for giving me this opportunity to present Virginia's effort on PFAS in our drinking water at this platform. Again, we have a huge VDH team that is working on this topic. So I'd like to acknowledge their contribution to this work. And Erik's presentation on emerging contaminants was great, and Rebecca set the stage already for PFAS, what PFAS contaminants are, and how and where they are found in really great detail. So I'll skip that part, and I'll just take you to this Virginia journey on PFAS in our drinking water. We did had UCMR3 PFAS sampling in Virginia. There were 2 systems that reported PFAS concentrations higher than the reporting limit. Further subsequent sampling resulted in less than the reporting limit number. So after UCMR3, we were doing some efforts, but most of our actions started with these 2 legislations that were passed by Virginia General Assembly last year in 2020. So we had this House Bill 586 that talks about that requires the state health commissioner to convene a Virginia-wide PFAS work group and then conduct a literature review investigation on what's the current state of things in this PFAS in drinking water, what other states are doing and how they are doing things, and then conduct a PFAS occurrence study at no more than 50 waterworks. And then the work group may develop MCL guidance, and they may recommend that sort of MCLs to Board of Health. The second legislation, House Bill 1257, it straight out asked us to develop MCLs for PFAS, and other PFAS compounds, 1,4-dioxane and chromium-6. I can share with you that in Virginia, we don't have a whole lot of data on 1,4-dioxane and chromium-6 in our drinking water. Both these reports, both these legislations, they asked us to submit multiple reports. One that's coming up is due on October 1st, the another one December 1st. So essentially all I'm telling you is that we had about 1 year to complete all these tasks and submit these reports. The big irony is that the legislations were passed, but with no associated funding, and PFAS is an expensive affair. So we reached out to our federal partner. US EPA gave us some funding, and I can share with you that for the PFAS work, we had less than $100,000 to complete all these tasks, and that's what we are working with so far. So the PFAS analytes in House Bill 586, they specifically mentioned these 6 PFAS analytes. I have highlighted PFBA for one reason, that in many other states, PFBS, sulfonate, is mentioned, but there are not that many states that have looked into the occurrence of PFBA. And I'd share some more importance of this PFBA later in the presentation. In MD's presentation, Rebecca gave a pretty good overview of PFAS in various matrices, various environments, medias, but this study in Virginia, because of the time and budget constraint, is very limited and very directed. So to start the study, we started our boundaries that the scope of this study is drinking water only, including source waters. So we're not looking into any other medias like wastewater or biosolids or landfill leachates or other things. So the first thing asked our state health commissioner to convene this work group, and we reached out to our stakeholders through various medias, Waterworks Advisory Committee, VA Warn, through our regional field offices. And what we communicated that we are looking for PFAS work group members who are knowledgeable and have interest in this emerging contaminants field, and who are willing to participate and contribute to this topic. By that means we wanted some members who can actively participate and take or give some time to this work group. And eventually, based on the legislation language and with our outreach activities back in September last year, we were able to form a 22+ member Virginia PFAS work group. And the members consisted of our waterworks, small, medium, large, and then we have representation from advocacy groups, general public, non-governmental environmental organizations, subject matter experts, and we also have PFAS manufacturers representation on this work group, as well as Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. So essentially, this is a slide that I show in all my presentations just to show what this work group consists of. And some of the participants on this call, they are also member of our work group. We wanted to give a good geographical representation when it comes to the membership on this work group. So this picture or this map shows the same geographical coverage. So essentially, as I mentioned earlier, we were given about 1 year to complete this task, and we formed this work group, and we had its kickoff meeting in October 2020. And we thought that 4 quarterly meetings may not work or may not give us the desired outcome. So we need, this is a more complex problem. So we formed 4 subgroups, one on health toxicology, occurrence and monitoring, policy and regulatory side, and treatment technologies. And these subgroups, they usually meet on a monthly basis. So essentially, these smaller subgroups meet on a monthly basis, have their discussions, and then they bring their findings to this quarterly main work group meeting, where the main work group discusses those findings and make recommendations to EDH. As this work group contains members from various fields, so we were thinking about logistics. So we came up with this SharePoint MS team as a way to share the resources with all the stakeholders. These are all public meetings. The work group as well as subgroup meetings, we post the meeting minutes, meeting agendas to this Virginia Town Hall website. We also have created a VDH Office of Drinking Water PFAS webpage that is more oriented about PFAS in drinking water only, not in other medias. And here is some information on the meetings that we have had so far, the work group meetings, October, January, March, and our recent meeting was on April 29th of, just a week back. So the first task was to convene the work group. We did that. And then the second task that was given to us was to look at what other states are doing, what's the current state of PFAS. So we have partnered up with the State University on carrying out that literature review, and Old Dominion University is currently working on that part for us. And that PFAS literature review team, they usually bring their findings or updates to our work group and subgroup meetings, and all our work group members have access to all the literature that we have collected so far on that side. The third task that we have on hand is to come up with a sampling study design. As I mentioned earlier, we were working with the less than $100,000. Legislation asked us to sample no more than 50 waterworks and water sources, and we wanted to design something that that gives us some meaningful results on the basis of which we can make some conclusions, or we can make some recommendations for future investigations. So essentially, with that concept in mind, we started developing this sampling study design in collaboration with our Virginia PFAS work group. And we paid attention to this study that we should come up with a strategy that provides maximum public health risk reduction when it comes to PFAS, and we should select the sites based on some prioritization based on their proximity to potential PFAS contamination. And we came up with a hybrid approach, and we used GIS to identify our 50 waterworks for this sampling study that we are we plan on sampling this month. So this hybrid approach contains some large waterworks, and then some potentially high risk groundwater systems, and some source water intakes, right? So essentially there are 3 groups that we selected. Group 1 contains 17 large waterworks in the Commonwealth. One of the reason for selecting these 17 large waterworks was that these waterworks, they provide drinking water to more than 4.5 million Virginians. So we wanted to see what 4.5 million Virginians are drinking. So this was the easy part. And to get our second group to identify our groundwater systems, we partnered up with the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, and for this investigation we focused, or for this whole PFAS exercise, our focus was on community and NTNC systems only. And with the DEQ, collaboration with DEQ, we got some data on unlined landfills in the Commonwealth, airports, like small or large airports, and industrial sites, and known or suspected contamination, PFAS contamination, if there was any data available, and any previous available data. I know this is not a very comprehensive list, but we wanted to design something pretty fast, and we thought that this list can provide us that prioritization in a short amount of time. So what we did, we got our groundwater systems on Virginia's map. We got unlined landfills, and we got large commercial and military airports on Virginia's map. And we created buffers, and we designated that if a groundwater system is within half mile, 0 to half mile of large airport or unlined landfill, then we designated that as potential high risk system. And if the system is within half a mile to 1 mile, that is potential moderate risk. So using this methodology, we were able to identify a total of 19 such system, potential high and moderate risk wells, groundwater systems, from 11 systems. And this is our group 2. So essentially in group 1, 17 large system. In group 2, we have 11 systems and total of 19 sampling locations. So between group 1 and 2, 17 plus 11, we were done with 28 out of 50 locations. And the third pool that we had was major water sources, and we thought of identifying or prioritizing source water intakes for the drinking water systems. So in this investigation, we partnered with the DEQ. We got list of WIPDs, potential direct dischargers. We received the data on POTWs with significant industrial users. And again, we plotted that data on this Virginia's map. So essentially, I know this is a pretty busy map here, but all we wanted to do was we wanted to identify group 3 systems that are source water intakes that are that may be potential that may have potential PFAS contamination, because they are downstream of either a POTW discharge points or WIPD's dischargers. And based on this analysis, we identified a total of 45 such intakes, and we have we had space for only 22 more sources. So we excluded intakes from 17 large water systems because they were already selected in group 1. Then the remaining list, we sorted that from largest to smallest population served, and that yielded us 29 intakes, and the proposal was to select 22 from that list. So here is this list of 29, and we selected 22 based on some other factors such as vulnerable age groups. If there is a school that serves younger children, it gets priority over another system that serves a smaller population. So essentially, here is the map that we have created in this sampling study designed for Virginia. You can see it depicts all the sampling locations that we plan on sampling here in Virginia, that consist of groundwater system, source water intakes, and large waterworks. And in numbers, from 50 locations, there are a total of 72 sampling points that we'll collect, and altogether this will give us information on what more than 4.5 million Virginians are drinking. Once this sampling study design was finalized, we shared it with our PFAS work group, the final design, and Then we got to the second stage, was sampling procedures, what system will sample at what place. So essentially, we plan on sampling at entry point for our surface water system, large water system, groundwater systems, and for source water intakes, that's the raw water sample taps. And we will provide with PFAS sampling instruction, because here we are asking our waterworks licensed operators to collect these PFAS samples for us. The PFAS analysis will be covered by VDH. And we did organize a sampling webinar just to show how to properly sample for PFAS and at what point and what needs to be taken care of during such steps for our licensed operators. Here again, selection of analytical method 537.1 versus something else. And as I mentioned earlier, PFBA is not an approved analyte on method 537.1, and this is mentioned in our legislation. So because of this, we selected method 533, isotopic dilution method, to go, and we have plans to monitor for 25 analytes using that method. We will collect source water intakes, as method 533 is an approved method for finished water, drinking water. But for our source water intakes, we have plans to use DOD method. Once our sampling study design was ready and our sampling procedures and sampling webinar and other instructions were ready, we communicated this information with our stakeholders, the 50 waterworks. We did that outreach through our regional field offices, then formal letters to these waterworks. And to make sure that those waterworks received these letters, we also asked them to sign and send back a page acknowledging and agreeing to participate in this program. And we also included our local health districts into this exercise, outreach exercise. So far, out of this 50, we have received 28 yeses, 1 declined, 1 we withdraw the sampling request, and we are still waiting. And all these things happened in less than a month, in April 2021. In phase 1 for this sampling, we will monitor, we will sample at entry point sampling. So essentially surface water system, 17 large water systems and groundwater systems. And phase 2 will focus on the source water intakes sampling. The reason is that we submitted a co-op to EPA. EPA approved us to go ahead to use method 533, but they have certain questions on using DOD method for source waters. So we're still working with EPA on getting an approval. That is why we divided this exercise into 2 phases. And we have contracted with an external lab, as our state lab, they do not have capability to analyze PFAS using method 533. They do have method 537.1 capability. So we partnered, we contracted with an external lab, and they have started shipping out these sampling kits to these water systems this week. There was a need and a concern on how and when to share these results. There was a need to get some more information for our waterworks and for general public, general messaging. So what we did is that let's develop a PFAS communication toolkit that will consist of all these things. It'll have a methodology or a process by which VDH plans on releasing these results. And then we have multiple fact sheets and messaging for customers and available resources for waterworks and general public that may be on available funding, technical guidance, or even general information on what these PFAS contaminants are. So essentially, there were some question on how we will review or verify or validate that data. So it's a pretty standard methodology as we got from method 533. And the plan is that these results will be maintained in a searchable database, but they'll not be part of CIDWIS or Drinking Water Watch, and we'll evaluate all the results, PFAS results, with the quality control, quality assurance project plan. And if this doesn't meet our quality assurance criteria, that those results will be invalid, and confirmation or sampling will take place at that location. This is again in-depth validation for some of the sampling, what activities will happen when we talk about in-depth data validation. So as I mentioned, we have plans. We haven't done any sampling so far. So plan moving forward between this April to June quarter is we're working or we're finalizing our communication toolkit, sampling related activities such as shipping the kits to these waterworks, updating our web page, and reports are due. And so we expect to receive or start receiving our results in June 2021, and we hope to release that by July or August of 2021. With that, I'll be happy to answer any question that anyone has on our plan, our approach, or our future plans. Thank you.